Hello and welcome to Lesson 4, Obedience and Situational Explanations. So in this session we are going to look at explanations for obedience, specifically the work of Milgram and what is referred to as situational variables affecting obedience. So a couple of key terms before we get stuck in: internal validity and external validity. When we are carrying out research, internal validity is absolutely essential. What it means is, are you actually measuring what you think you're measuring? So in this case, a more formal way of saying that is the degree to which your measurement, i.e. your dependent variable, is the result of whatever you changed in the experiment. So if I want to see if aggression is affected by temperature, the thing I'm changing is going to be temperature. But the thing I'm measuring is going to be aggression. There's lots of other factors that could influence that. What if in my sample I just get a load of psychopaths, really aggressive psychopaths? That's going to affect my results. Temperature might have had nothing to do with it. External validity. So if internal is all about within the study, making sure everything's right in the study so that you're establishing cause and effect between the independent and the dependent variable. External is your study, does it actually represent behavior in the real world? Can you take your findings and apply it in the real world? And this is going to be something we're coming back to when we're talking about laboratory experiments, because they tend to be quite low in external validity. So a bit of background before we get into Milgram's research. Milgram was highly influenced by the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was a Nazi SS officer, and he was one of the key individuals behind the final solution. What is interesting about Eichmann is he actually escaped the Nuremberg trials, and he was eventually apprehended in South America, where he'd been hiding out. And he was taken to Israel, put on trial and executed. What concerned a lot of people who watched Eichmann's trial was just how normal he seemed. He was just a clerk. He was just an administrator. He wasn't a violent, aggressive man. He was quite timid and mild-mannered. But he was very much like a typical sort of bank clerk or something like that. And that worried people because until then, they could write off the Holocaust as being a sort of something special about Germans. You know, the Germans are just a bit different, and that's why they did it, but we could never do it. Eichmann challenged some of those preconceptions, especially for Milgram. So Milgram Study, what did he do then? So he wanted to see if people would obey legitimate authority to give when they were given instructions to harm another person. So if someone tells you to harm someone else, will you obey? Ordinary people. Remember, a substantial number of researchers at the time believed that only psychopaths would do that sort of thing. And if you remember from the sort of Germans a different hypothesis, that's how people viewed the Germans, that they were different. Maybe they were more aggressive or whatever. The procedure then. You got this in your guide notes in a lot more detail, which is what you need, but here's a breakdown. The teacher and learner were put in separate rooms. The teacher was then asked by the experimenter, who wore a lab coat, that's interesting, to administer electric shocks, which were actually harmless to the learner, and each time he gave a wrong answer. These shocks increased by 15 volts for every wrong answer. What they found was the results showed that all participants went to 300 volts. Now, bear in mind the average UK plug socket has a voltage of 240. In America it's less than that. I think it's about half. But still, there are signs on, you're taught from a very young age not to put your fingers in a plug socket, and yet all of the participants in Milgram Study were willing to give that shock to the learner. 65% of Milgram's participants went all the way to 450. 450 is a lethal voltage, potentially. Overall, Milgram carried out 18 variations of his study, and we'll look at those variations next time. This diagram gives you an idea of how the machine was labelled. There were switches underneath that the teacher would switch every time we got a wrong answer, and they would escalate the voltage. Each voltage had a label: slight, discomfort, painful, that sort of stuff, right up to danger, and then XXX. So the participant was under no illusions that this was harmless. Evaluation of Milgram then. So this study may lack internal validity, and we'll talk about that, but although it's groundbreaking and shocking, and you walk away with it saying, okay, in a room, think about the last room you were in, 65% of those people, if Milgram's right, would be willing to give a lethal electric shock to a stranger. That's very worrying. You start looking at your friends and family in a whole new light. But actually, does that sort of activity really apply to real life? You are not asked to give electric shocks to strangers in everyday tasks, at least not in the West. And therefore, can we really apply the findings to real examples of obedience? Think about obedience in the military or obedience in school situations and so forth. Perhaps not, because when we carry out research in these tightly controlled artificial environments, and the task itself is quite artificial, they lack mundane realism, and the degree to which we can generalize is questionable. So let's talk about internal validity. Could there be an alternative explanation within the study itself that explained the behaviour, other than the fact that they were just obeying what Milgram suggested was legitimate authority? Well, one possibility is demand characteristics. We touched on this before. Remember, demand characteristics is when the participant figure out the purpose of the experiment and behave in a way that they believe will please the experimenter. Milgram disputes the idea that demand characteristics could have been present, but however, Milgram points out that many of the participants showed signs of extreme distress, and this suggests that they weren't just playing along with the roles they were assigned. Lab versus field. We can also contrast, so if external validity is an issue, then actually carrying research out in a field experiment may be a more valid method. So a field experiment are control studies that take place in a natural setting. Like laboratory experiments, we're still manipulating the IV to measure a causal relationship with the DV. A field experiment could take place in a school or a hospital or in a town centre or a shopping mall or something like that. Hoffling's study is one that's well worth knowing for the exam, and that's a great example of a field study. Has much higher ecological validity than Milgram, though the situation is not totally natural, and we'll talk about why that is in a bit. Ethics. This is the main criticism levelled at Milgram, is that his approach was highly unethical. And in fact, research from Ash, Milgram and Zimbardo all contributed to the sort of changing of the ethical framework proposed by the American Psychological Association. So, informed consent. This is an ethical issue that researchers have to take really seriously. Consent should be sought from participants so that each explicitly agrees to take part knowing the aims of the research. Now, in an ideal world, that's exactly what we do every time. However, in social influence research, because deception is required, this is sometimes not possible. Remember, deception is deliberately withholding information, so these two are contradictory. You can't deliberately withhold key information and tell the person the aims of the research, often. So in social influence research, we have this conflict. And really it's about a balance. And the researcher will have to decide, is the deception worth it in order to sort of, as a consequence, sacrifice and informed consent. After, if we remember, the 84% said that they were glad to have taken part in the study. So informed consent and deception are really important issues for psychologists, but there are ways around them. Psychological harm and the right to withdraw. Psychological harm is a bigger issue. A researcher has an ultimate responsibility to prevent physical harm. Psychological harm is sometimes a bit more tricky to deal with, but the essence here is, with physical harm, participants should not be exposed to any risk greater than that in everyday life. So, for example, you could ask a participant to ride a bicycle, and if they fell off, you wouldn't be kicked out of the profession for negligence, because you might fall off a bike in everyday life. But if you take something like, simulated torture, we're going to keep them awake for 3 days playing them Mariah Carey on a loop, that's greater than the sort of harm you'd experience in everyday life. Psychological harm is much trickier, as I said, to pin down. Essentially, you have to avoid causing stress, embarrassment, and anything that might affect their self-esteem. The essence here is that the participants should leave the study in the same condition they entered it. Another crucial ethical issue is making it clear that participants have the right to withdraw at any point during the study, irrespective of things like payment. In some of the early studies, when they introduced payment for participants said that they felt obligated to continue in the study even if they didn't want to. In Milgram's case, he was very clear actually at the beginning that they could withdraw at any time and they'd still get paid. Having said that, the mere presence of payment might create undue influence. Okay, deception. Is it actually crucial in social influence research? Ethical guidelines say you need to avoid it. And some psychologists have had to try and tried to develop an ethical framework to investigate obedience. So Berger in 2009 carried out face-to-face Milgram style experiments with the shock level set at 150. This means that it's not going to cause any permanent harm. Interestingly, he found similar rates of obedience in concordance with Milgram's original study. So this suggests that we don't necessarily have to behave in an unethical way in order to investigate this topic. Having said that, deception was still involved in the study, and an element of deception is often present in most psychological studies. Virtual reality, there's some great psychological work going on in virtual reality at the moment. In one case, Slater et al. 2006 asked participants to play the role of teacher, interacting with a virtual learner and administering electric shocks. This method enabled Slater to experiment with technologies like SMS, text messaging and things like that. In the text variation of the experiment, Pease went to the highest level of the shock generator. And this is interesting. This is starting to lead us to this idea that when Milgram, obedience was quite high when the participant couldn't see the effect, the consequences of their action. And what we see here is actually, in Slater's study, when you send a text message, which is even less personal than talking to someone live over a radio, you rapidly ascend the shock generator scale. And this has implications for cyberbullying, but also impacts and supports Milgram's original experiment. Okay, so that's the content. There's obviously loads more in your guide notes that you need to know, but you don't need me to read and discuss a lot of that information. It's just knowledge that you've got to learn. These are questions you'll be doing for next lesson. So, identify 4 examples of deception in the passage below, and identify and explain one of the ethical issues that is evident in the passage. 6 marks. So Milgram obtained participants for his study by placing an advertisement in a local newspaper, asking for volunteers for a study on the effects of punishment on learning. When participants arrived at the laboratory, they were told one of them would be the teacher and one of them would be the learner. They drew lots to decide which would be which. However, the draw was rigged so that the participant always became the teacher. The teacher was told they would be required to give a series of increasingly severe electric shocks to the learner. However, in reality, no electric shocks were actually administered. In the person who was the learner, the person who was the learner was actually an actor hired by Milgram. So, identify 4 examples of deception in the passage below and identify and explain one of the ethical issues that is evident in the passage. 6 marks. So you get 4 for identifying the deception and 2 marks for explaining one ethical issue. Right, another question. Milgram modified his experiment, in one variation. The experimenter gave teachers orders over the phone, and in another required the participant to force the learner's hand onto an electric plate. What effect do you think these variations would have on obedience rates? So, you're being asked to extrapolate from what you know about obedience to a situation that you don't know. I'm going to be a little lenient, obviously, because we're going to look at variations of Milgram in a lot of detail next time. But this is to get your instinct. What happened when the experimenter told the teacher over the phone to give the shocks and encouraged them to continue over the phone? And what happened when the teachers had to physically force down the learner's hand onto a plate, causing an electric shock? Remember, bring those questions with you next time, and we'll go through some superb answers. As always, thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, fire an email or bring them to class with you. See you later.
Audio Jungle.